Well, good afternoon. It's afternoon here in St. Louis, and we've had a beautiful day outside. And I'm here to address one tough question for Covenant Theological Seminary. And the question for today is, what was crucifixion like in the time of Jesus? Just by way of brief introduction, my name is David Chapman, and I am professor of New Testament and Archaeology at Covenant Theological Seminary. Uh, One of the reasons this question is tough uh, is I'm trying to consolidate into about 10 minutes what I've spent a good portion of my academic work doing. So just for a quick show and tell, and not to laud these things, but just to mention it, I've written now about 700 pages or a little over that now on crucifixion in terms of crucifixion antiquity. Short book that Eckhard Schnabel and I did on the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. It's about 800 pages. And then my dissertation was on ancient Jewish and Christian perceptions of crucifixion. So in about 10 minutes, I'm going to try and survey that material. And what also makes this tough is that I've taken about 400 or so ancient sources and trying to summarize what we can learn from that in short order and give you a quick summary without going into all the debates, but some essential stuff to know. So, what was crucifixion like in the time of Jesus? Now, here's our structure. I want to speak briefly to the shape of the cross and the causes of death. And then I want to look at what I call perceptions of crucifixion, first in the Roman world, and then in early Judaism. So that's our basic outline here. So I'm just going to plunge in, and one of the good things is I know you can pause this video, you can go back, repeat it, any section that I cover maybe a little quickly. First of all, let's talk about the shape of the cross. One of the reasons I do this is that this has become an area of major debate among crucifixion scholars, and there's a few of us that work in this area. It's also an area that people often ask about when I'm in the church. So what did this cross look like? Well, the first thing to say is that there are multiple forms of the cross. So you and I probably, especially because we've seen crosses in churches or outside churches around this fair land, have an image of the cross and kind of assume that that's what the cross looked like. But we have to acknowledge that crucifixion could take multiple forms in antiquity. So to give you a couple of examples of this, Seneca, who's a Roman philosopher around the time of Jesus, it mentions that he sees crosses, uses the Latin term cruces, crux is we get cross from this, not merely of one kind, he says, but fashioned differently by different people. A certain one suspends a person with his head upside down towards the ground, which markedly is how Peter was said to have been crucified a few decades after Jesus. Others impale a stake through the sexual organs, and others extend the victim's arm by a yoke or a patibulum. That last case kind of sounds like what we expect in terms of Jesus, arms extended by a yoke or a patibulum, which would be the kind of the crossbar. But he lists that as one of several kinds. Now, he does say not merely of one kind, which may indicate that at least some people in Seneca's readership might have assumed that as soon as he says the word crux, that there was a particular kind in mind. But he goes on to clarify that he has seen actually multiple kinds during his life. Josephus, who's a Jewish historian in the first century, wrote about the times of Jesus and around that time of Jesus, says of the destruction of Jerusalem about 40 years after Jesus' death, that the Roman soldiers, on account of their anger and hatred towards the Jewish people who are hiding in the city of Jerusalem, for a joke, nailed in various forms those who had been captured. Because of the multitude, both the space was lacking for the crosses and crosses were lacking for the body. So there were a lot of crucifixions that went on in those days around Jerusalem. And the soldiers were given the ability to play with the various forms there. So I think it's very important that we not assume that crucifixion needs to take just one form. And this has led to a whole sorts of debates about the definition of crucifixion. My own approach is to basically just follow where the main crucifixion terms are used and not worry about the particulars of the shape of the cross, but to understand that these are all unified in terms of the perception that the Romans and the Jewish people had towards people undergoing that kind of death by suspension. So that's what we'll do here. However, there are certainly examples that show us that a cross, much like you and I think of as being a cross, was in use in antiquity. And so here is a graffiti. We have a couple of major graffiti from antiquity. These are just kind of scrawled on the walls. In this case, this graffito is just scrawled on a wall in Puteoli, which is in kind of near modern Naples, if you would, in Italy. And you can see this person is being appended with their arms outstretched with a crossbar. And so there's a lot of similarity to what you and I might think of in terms of the shape of the cross. Now, it's a different thing to then ask, what was Jesus crucified on? I don't know that we can know this for certain. And by the way, I would also say I don't know that it matters in some measure, because the gospel authors, the early Christians, don't try and describe the shape of Jesus' cross per se for the sake of its shape and for drawing much meaning out of the shape. They simply say that Jesus was crucified. And so that's enough in a sense. But I think we can say that Jesus' cross was likely shaped something similar to what you and I often see today. And I say that for a few reasons. One is that Jesus' hands and his feet were nailed. And so Jesus, in the resurrection accounts, shows his hands and feet. And in John 20, it's specifically said by Thomas, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails. So it seems that his nails were or his hands were nailed, and presumably his feet as well. And so you have at least that. So that however he was attached to this device, it was through nails in his hands and his feet. Beyond that, we can also acknowledge that there was a titulus, a statement over his head that proclaimed kind of what his offense. He was claimed to be king of the Jews. And so that would indicate that there was some space over the cross for at least that. Now, aside from that, again, some have suggested, like Jehovah's Witnesses, that, that could have just been an upright stake that he was appended to. But the earliest Christian memory after that often make connections between Jesus' cross and to something that looks T-shaped. So in what's called the Epistle of Barnabas, which is written in the very end of the first, early beginning of the second century, mentions. So this is right after the apostolic period. It's not in the New Testament, but it's in the earliest Christian writings after the New Testament. It says that the cross was shaped like the tau, and the tau is the Greek word for a T, and we would say. Beyond that, later in the second century, Justin Martyr, again a famous early church author, makes a number of analogies to the cross, to things that are T-shaped, like the sail of a ship, or shovels, or human form when it's erect with arms extended, or Roman military banners, etc. So you see the list here, and those are collected from a few different areas in Justin's writings. Beyond that, we also have some early images. Principally, the ones from within Christian circles don't really start until 200, 300 years after the time of Jesus, and then become more frequent after that period too. And these, again, are typically T-shaped. But it's very likely, and we'll return to this, that this is an image that was a pagan mockery of Christianity, that again assumes that Jesus, or this person who's being worshipped, is on a T-shaped device. So we'll return to that. So I would suggest that the earliest evidence does suggest that Jesus was shaped on something that was likely T-shaped. Now, after that, people often ask me in the church, what caused Jesus' death? Now, in a similar way to saying that the cross didn't have a single shape, I think we also have to acknowledge that as far as the best kind of medical analysis today suggests that the kinds of deaths, and there were a lot of people that died on crosses, probably had multiple causes, so multifactorial. I'll give you a couple of examples of this, but let me first say that the answer that we get to this is going to hinge on what we think the shape of the cross is. And if we acknowledge that not every crucifixion in antiquity had the same shape to it, then from the very beginning we're going to say that probably there are multiple causes for death. Secondly, it was very common for torture to precede crucifixion. And so this means that the body had been substantially injured and the person would have been substantially fatigued even before they go to the place of the cross. And so there were additional factors that need to be taken into account that could have led to the person's death, with crucifixion only being one aspect of that. Now, having said that, there are a variety of ways that people have talked about the means of death, and you'll see this in various kind of medical treatments. Asphyxiation, one of the things I've heard in a lot of sermons is that the outstretched arms would have caused pressure on the chest cavity, and that would have led to the person not being able to breathe. Now, actually, there's very little medical evidence for that. So I wouldn't pass that along if I were you. And I wouldn't hold that to be the only possible form of death, even on a cross-shaped device. Other things that have been suggested is shock or cardiac arrest, or there's been a recent set of studies from Europe that have suggested that if a person stands still for a long period of time, just the blood in their body, even if you're not injured, tends to go to your lower extremities, and it can cause you to pass out, can actually cause a person to die. And so that's been another suggestion. But I think the best answers to this are multifactorial. So to give you an example of that, in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, from a few decades ago, there was a study that basically came to multiple suggestions. Death may have been hastened simply by a state of exhaustion and by the severity of the scourging, with its resulting blood loss in pre-shock state. The fact that he could not carry his patibulum supports that interpretation. Patibulum would have been the crossbar that he would have carried to his place of execution. The actual cause of Jesus' death, like that of other crucified victims, may have been, and now look at this, multifactorial, related primarily, and notice the kind of things that they're going to list: hypovolemic shock, exhaustion, asphyxia, perhaps acute heart failure. A fatal cardiac arrhythmia may have accounted for the apparent catastrophic terminal event. Thus, it remains unsettled whether Jesus died of a cardiac rupture or a cardiorespiratory failure. And then from a slightly more recent article in the Royal Society of Medicine from Britain, our conclusion is that at present there is insufficient evidence to safely state exactly how people did die from crucifixion in Roman times. It's quite likely that different individuals died from different physiological causes. So I think honestly we can't fully say, in Jesus' case or in general terms, the one thing that caused his death. Probably there are a lot of factors involved, and there were probably different people died for different reasons when appended to a cross. Now, I think the more interesting questions have to do with how people perceived of crucifixion. Not what did it look like or how did it happen, how did the person die, but how did people around crucified folks feel about crucifixion. And a way that I've often thought about this is if you're reading through the Gospels or any of the early Christian literature, one of the things to wonder about is how somebody who is outside the church or maybe new in the church would have thought about crucifixion the moment that they first hear that Jesus was crucified. So a way to think of this is if you're a good Roman person and I come up to you and I say, I've met the person who is the Lord and Savior of the universe. And you say, well, tell me about him. And then I say, well, he was crucified. What immediately goes through your head when you hear this person was crucified? Similarly, if you were a Jewish person in the first century and somebody comes up to you and says, they've met the Messiah. You say, well, tell me about him. And the first thing they say, well, is he was crucified. What, again, as a Jewish person, do you think? How does crucifixion fit with that Messiah word? I want to give you a few hints at this. And we'll start with the Roman world and then move to the Jewish world. So in terms of the Roman world, crucifixion was reserved primarily for thieves, slaves, and rebels. So again, if I say, this Lord and Savior of the universe was crucified, you might immediately think, well, that means he was associated with thieves, slaves, and rebels, which actually, in his death, he was. Remember, he's crucified between two thieves, really two laestai, two brigands, if you would, is better, because these are violent criminals that he's being crucified among. Slaves and rebels. As a rule, Roman citizens would not be crucified. Scourging and mutilation often preceded crucifixion, and crucifixion was a long, painful way to die, which was designed to produce shame. Now, I'll give you a few examples of these just from a few texts. Again, I've collected hundreds of these in the published works I mentioned earlier. And I'm not alone in that, by the way. One of the greatest books that goes back quite a ways was written by Martin Hengel. It's just entitled Crucifixion, also collected in this work called The Cross of the Son of God. And I think he still gave us one of the nicest, very helpful, quick summaries of what crucifixion was like in the pagan world. Plutarch tells us that every criminal who goes to execution must carry his own cross on his back. Again, that probably means the crossbar, not the whole of the cross, but the very top portion of it. Regularly done, but not necessarily done in every event, but we do have at least one inscription that testifies to this in a number of ancient texts that mentions this as something that was expected of criminals in at least some of the crucifixions. Cicero indicates his aversion to the cross and how this is not something that you do to Roman citizens, multiple places, but especially in a kind of legal work that he produced called Against Verres. To bind a Roman citizen, he says, is a crime. To flog him is an abomination. To slay him is almost an act of murder. To crucify him is what? There's no fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a deed. Seneca, whom we met earlier, a pagan philosopher, Roman philosopher, said, can anyone be found who would prefer wasting away in pain, dying limb by limb? Now, what he's doing right here is he's describing crucifixion. He's doing so in an argument that he's making about that excuses suicide effectively, saying that there's some deaths that are so horrible that one would rather commit suicide. And crucifixion is his preeminent example here. And so he describes it as dying limb by limb, letting life drop out drop by drop, being fastened to the accursed tree. They're describing crucifixion. Long, sickly, already deformed, swelling with ugly tumors on chest and shoulders. He speaks of long, drawn-out agony. He thinks that a person would have many excuses for dying even before mounting the cross, and therefore would have been better off committing suicide. That's the argument there. But in doing so, he kind of gives us a very vivid description of what crucifixion would have been like and what Romans would have seen, and therefore what they would have felt about this is a horrible way to die. And it's also, as a consequence, just very shameful as well. So I give you here a few kind of summaries of crucifixion in the Roman world, reserved primarily for thieves, slaves, and rebels, not for Roman citizen, that it often employed scourging, mutilation, nails, and those kind of things happen in the gospel accounts. I don't give you all the text for that. You can, if you really want to look at this, you can look at some other writings I've done on this to get a sense of that. But it's certainly a very painful way to die. Let's move to perceptions of crucifixion in early Judaism. What did they think? What did they kind of feel in their gut when they heard that somebody had been crucified? And here I note that Jewish people shared similar views about crucifixion as other people in the Greco-Roman world. However, many strands of Judaism additionally connected crucifixion with scriptural examples, especially with the curse of God in Deuteronomy 21. Now, to look at that, let me just kind of emphasize there are two key differences. On the whole, Jewish people in the first century are experiencing crucifixion much like the Romans do. They see crucifixions going on. They're going to have many of the same perceptions. Same kind of people are going to go to crosses, and it's going to be as horrible a way of dying and shame, and many of these kind of things are going to be in one's mind. But there were two key differences for first century Jewish people. First, they will have known that many of their fellow Jewish people died by crucifixion. And then secondly, they're going to associate crucifixion with Old Testament examples of people who in the Old Testament are said to have been hung on the tree. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. First, with regard to that, they would have known many people, many Jewish people who would have been crucified. Two quick texts on that, both from Josephus, our first century Jewish historian. One speaks of a Roman governor, Verus, who had to suppress an insurrection or rebellion. And one of the ways that you suppress an insurrection in the Roman world, and what you do with the leaders, is you crucify them. So Josephus mentions that this is, by the way, a Jewish insurrection against the Romans. And he says that Verus took the less turbulent individuals and just imprisoned them, but the people who were kind of the leaders, the most culpable people in this Jewish insurrection, he crucified. And here Josephus says there are about 2,000. So whether that's an accurate number or not, clearly a huge number of people, Jewish people, are being crucified. Now, from the Romans and from the people who, even among the Jewish leaders, are going to side with the Romans, that's the thing you do with rebels, you crucify them. On the other hand, if you happen to be a Jewish or brother, sister, family member, or friend of one of those people who are being crucified, you might be much more sympathetic to the plight that they're undergoing. And then similarly, I gave you a portion of this text earlier. This is Jerusalem during the Jewish revolt against Rome in AD 70. And just as Jerusalem is about to fall to the Romans have captured Jerusalem. They've hemmed it in. They are starving the people out in the city. And it is said that 500 or sometimes more of the Jewish people who are trying to escape them from the city just to get some food are being captured daily, and they're regularly being put to crucifixion. And the goal, in part, is to ring the city with crucifixion in order to encourage the people inside to surrender, because it's such a horrible means of death. You'd be better to give in to the Romans, let them enslave you and cart you to the rest of the Roman world, but at least you don't have to undergo crucifixion. And it's in that context that earlier passage that we saw where soldiers rage in hatred, amuse themselves by nailing their prisoners in different postures occurs. Now, one of our best archaeological portraits of crucifixion comes from this period, and it shows a crucified body. So there was a kind of a bone reburial box found outside of Jerusalem, and in it, the box is shown here again, and an inscription on the side naming Yochanan as the occupant of the box. Actually, there were a few different individuals that were in this box, 3 in particular. But one of them had a nail in his calcaneum, which is his heel bone. And you can see a healthy calcaneum there on the left, and then on the right-hand side of the picture, you can see the one that was found in this small ossuary outside Jerusalem that had a nail through it, and this is the artist's reconstruction of it. This is a model of it that you can see if you go to the Israel Museum today, and you can see the nail there through the person's heel bone. In light of that, a variety of postures have been suggested, the most probable of which is the bottom right here, because it seemed that there was one nail used for each of the ankle bones, and there doesn't seem to have been sufficient damage to the person's arms for them to have been nailed. So in this case, in this individual, his arms probably were attached to a cross by ropes. And so this is one of those examples. There's, by the way, a more recent example found in Italy, in the Po Valley, but it's being debated as to whether it's an example of crucifixion again. There was again that kind of a hole in the person's heel bone that is associated with crucifixion, but it may have actually been caused by animals or plants in the burial area. So this is debated, but our best example actually comes from Jerusalem. Now, not only were there a lot of people crucified, and so Jewish people would have seen this regularly, But again, there's Old Testament passages that mention somebody hung up on a tree that then in later Jewish retellings of the story often get applied with crucifixion terminology like stauros, which is the Greek word for a cross. I've done an extensive study of these, but let me point you to just two of them. One has to do with, in the book of Esther, Haman, who is the arch nemesis of the Jewish people. It's not really overstating matters to say, in a sense, he attempted to be the Hitler of the ancient world, in that he called for the death of all Jewish people in the Persian Empire. Now, however, Haman is pitted in the book of Esther against Mordecai, who's the Jewish person, who's a renowned person in Persia in the day, who's Jewish. And ultimately, as the book goes on, Haman tries to put Mordecai to death and hang him up on a tree. But the Persian king becomes wise to Haman's schemes, and instead, Haman, this arch nemesis of the Jewish people, is hung up on a tree. So this is one of those texts in the book of Esther in chapter 7. Now, if you're thinking of this from the Jewish perspective, and you hear that this Messiah figure has been crucified, hung up on a tree, if you would, you might well think, well, that's just like what happened to Haman, who's our arch nemesis. How could this be the Messiah? Might be one of the reactions that you might have. By the way, one of the striking evidences for this is that the Septuagint, early Greek translation, done by Jewish folks about 3 centuries before Jesus, roughly, 2 to 3 centuries, uses the term stauros, the Greek word for cross, in referring to Haman's death. And then in Deuteronomy, it's strikingly said of the person who is hung up on a tree because he did something worthy of a death penalty. And he is hung up on a tree in keeping with Jewish law. It is said of him that a curse of God bears on the one who is hung. And this was interpreted in the Septuagint and many other Jewish translations as being the person being cursed by God. Again, if that's the case, then it helps us understand how Paul in the book of Galatians will wrestle with this idea of a curse being applied to the Messiah because the Messiah is hung up. Galatians chapter 3. We see this, by the way, in Philo, who associates this very text in Deuteronomy 21 with somebody being crucified. As he says here, somebody who takes human life is ordered by the person who produced the law, namely God himself, to be crucified. And the Son is not to set upon him like who's being crucified. Clear allusion to Deuteronomy 21. So, summary of crucifixion in early Judaism. There's a lot of testimony of crucifixion and baptism in Palestine, both literary, Josephus, and then our main archaeological evidence. Jewish people shared similar views about crucifixion as other people in the Greco-Roman world. They saw the same kind of people being crucified. But they also connected crucifixion with some particular scriptural examples. Now, if I can show you one last, by the way, there's one other thing here which I've not taken the time to cover because I've already over my 10-minute allotment here. There was a debate about whether it was legal for Jewish leaders to crucify. I have a whole section on this. I can point that to you. If you show up for our Q&A time, we can talk about that further. But let me show you one final image. I've shown it to you before. This was found in the Palatine Hill in Rome. And what you see here is an individual who has the head, interestingly, of a donkey or a mule, but clearly a human being, presumably naked or certainly not covered well, on a cross, and then another individual off to the side with an arm raised in a gesture which the Romans usually associate with worship. And there's an inscription here found on this very famous kind of graffito that says Alexamenos Sebete Theu, which is Greek for Alexamenos, worship God. It's kind of portrayed in that terms. Now, likely this is a reference to this person here whose arm is raised in worship, and it's making a mockery really of what he's doing, because who in the world will worship a crucified individual, let alone a crucified individual who has the head of a donkey? And yet here he's being directed to worship. Now, what's striking about this is a couple of things. One is um, a way that Roman pagans often made fun of Judaism was to say that they worshipped a donkey. It was said uh, that in the temple in Jerusalem there was a donkey, statue of a donkey that was worshipped. Now that clearly wasn't true, but that was a common thing that was said of Jewish people. And so this seems to have kind of a Jewish dimension to it. Beyond that, here's a crucified individual who's being worshipped. So this pretty clearly seems to be a mockery of Christianity associated with Judaism, a crucifixion victim being worshipped. And this shows, again, I think the kind of mockery that a pagan might immediately have if they heard of Christians worshiping a crucified individual. And in fact, if you look at the writings of Lucian and others, you'll see that the very crucifixion of Jesus was often used as a point of mockery from pagan philosophers and others making fun of Christianity. And it's in that context that we'll end with this. By the way, I mentioned Martin Hengel's book on crucifixion. He ends with this as well, and so I'm following in his order a couple other key authors that I would mention, friends of mine that I should give a quick shout out to. Gunnar Samuelson, his excellent work on crucifixion and antiquity, kind of entering into a whole debate about the nature of crucifixion terminology, which I will leave for another day, but very helpful. And then John Granger Cook's book on crucifixion in the Mediterranean world, also quite helpful. But let's end on this. 1 Corinthians 1, Paul points out that the wisdom of God is effectively foolishness to man, because he says Jews ask for signs and Greeks search for wisdom. And in fact, Jews do ask for miracles of their Messiah, and Greeks do search for the philosophy that comes with good wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. So we might reflect on what does that mean. You know, there's probably a lot going on there, but one dimension of this would be if you were a Gentile and a pagan person in antiquity, this is a point of mockery for Christianity, that they would worship a crucified figure as their Lord and Savior. And to Jewish people, this is not at all what we expected our Messiah to be. A Messiah who does engage in one of the most horrible of deaths and the shame of that and such things. But moreover, a Messiah who's associated with those Old Testament figures like Haman, or with the surprising words in Deuteronomy 21, that this is the kind of a person who's cursed of God is associated with crucifixion. And then Paul affirms that to those who are called, both Jews and Greek, Christ is instead the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So there's a quick accounting, maybe a little longer than I planned, but hopefully that's useful to you as you reflect on some aspects of crucifixion in antiquity, how it would have been perceived by both pagan people and Jewish people in antiquity, and some of the ramifications for the Christian proclamation of the cross in the midst of that. Again, I think at least some of us are going to get together and have a quick Q&A on this, and I hope that this leads to a lot of fruitful discussion. Thank you for your time, and I hope that this has been of some use to you.